My name is Dorothy Marsh, and I need to tell you about two little girls who disappeared from a hillside above the town of Carson, Washington, on December 26, 1958, and what I found when I went looking for them 19 years later. I need to tell you because I was there when they disappeared, and I was there when they came back, and I have spent the last 47 years carrying a weight that I am no longer willing to carry alone. Before we get into it, let me know where you are watching from, and whether you have had an encounter like this one. The girls were named Ruth and Clara Voss. Ruth was 11 years old. Clara was 8. They were the daughters of Carl Voss, who worked at the Wind River Tree Nursery on Forest Road, 3065 north of Carson, and his wife, Edna, who took in sewing and raised chickens, and attended the Lutheran church in Stevenson every Sunday without fail. The Voss family had lived in the Wind River Valley for 6 years by the time that December came. They were not newcomers. They knew the forest the way mountain people know things, not from maps, but from memory and routine and the particular smell of the air when weather was moving in from the northwest. I was 9 years old in December of 1958. My family lived 3 houses down from the Vosses on what everyone called the Nursery Road, which was not much more than a gravel track running north from Carson along the east bank of the Wind River. My father worked for the Forest Service as a timber surveyor. My mother kept a garden and a root cellar, and seemed to know where every child in a half-mile radius was at any given moment of the day. I was Dorothy Aldrich then. I did not become Dorothy Marsh until I married Jim Marsh in 1972. Ruth Voss was my closest friend. We had been inseparable since the 2nd grade, which is remarkable only because Ruth was 2 years older than me and had absolutely no reason to waste her time on a younger girl, except that she was the kind of person who did not sort people by age or rank or social standing. She sorted them by whether they were interesting and whether they were honest. And somehow, at age 7, I had managed to pass both tests. Clara was Ruth's little sister and therefore permanently attached to any plan Ruth and I made, which was occasionally inconvenient and usually fine. The day after Christmas in 1958 was a clear, cold day following 3 days of heavy snowfall. The 1950s were a different era for snow in the Pacific Northwest. The Western Washington Climate Office has documented that the region averaged over 17 inches of snowfall per year during the 1950s, compared to roughly 5 inches in more recent decades. In the Wind River Valley that December, we had nearly 2 feet on the ground from a storm system that had moved through on December 22nd and sat over southwestern Washington for most of 3 days. By December 26th, the snow had settled into a dense, heavy pack that was perfect for sledding on the long hill behind the nursery worker housing. That hill ran from the tree line at the back of the properties down to the open field above the Wind River, a drop of maybe 200 feet over a quarter mile. We had been sledding it since the snow fell, all the children from the nursery families together, and by December 26th, we knew every bump and curve, and the one place on the left side where a root hump would send you sideways if you did not steer around it. We were not careless children. We were mountain children, which is a different thing. I was not with Ruth and Clara when they disappeared. That is the fact that has shaped my life more than any other single fact. I had gone inside for lunch at noon, and my mother kept me home afterward because I had been out in the cold since 7 in the morning, and she was concerned about my ears. Ruth and Clara were still on the hill when I went inside. There were 4 other children out there with them. The Bremer boys, who were 8 and 10, and 2 girls from the Hartley family, who were 12 and 13. By 2 in the afternoon, the Bremer boys had gone inside. By 3, the Hartley girls had gone in. By 3:30, when the light was already going gray under the fir canopy, nobody had seen Ruth or Clara for at least an hour. Edna Voss noticed they were not home for supper at 5 o'clock. By 5:30, Carl Voss was on the telephone to the Forest Service ranger station. By 6, with full dark settled over the valley and the temperature dropping toward 12 degrees, the first search began. I am going to tell you exactly what that search found and what it did not find. And then I am going to tell you what I found 19 years later, and you can make of it what you will. The searchers that night covered the hill, the tree line above it, and the Wind River bank below. They had lanterns and 2 flashlights, and a group of about 16 men from the nursery and from Carson. They found the sled. It was a red, flexible flyer. Ruth Voss had brought it from Portland the previous Christmas, and it was sitting in the snow at the top of the hill near the tree line, about 30 feet from where the Douglas fir began. There were tracks in the snow around the sled, child-sized boot prints, 2 sets, which matched the boots Ruth and Clara had been wearing. The tracks led toward the tree line. They entered the trees. And then, according to every person who participated in that search, they simply stopped. I have had 66 years to think about what that means, and I will not pretend that it is an easy thing to explain. The official search and rescue report, which I obtained a copy of in 1979 through a public records request to Skamania County, states that the tracks were lost due to wind disturbance under the tree canopy. But the man who led that first night search was a Forest Service ranger named Howard Kepler. And Howard Kepler told my father privately, about 2 weeks after the search had been called off, that the tracks did not end because of wind. They ended because whatever was making them left the ground. He did not say it that way exactly. He said the tracks went forward, 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 and then there was a gap. And on the other side of the gap, the snow was undisturbed, not drifted over, not filled in. Undisturbed, as if nothing had passed through it at all. The search ran for 11 days. Ravalli County Search and Rescue coordinated with the Skamania County Sheriff's Department, which in 1958 meant a sheriff named Dale Prouty and 3 deputies covering a county of 1,656 square miles of mountainous terrain. The Forest Service brought in dogs on the 3rd day. The dogs tracked to the tree line and stopped at the same place the human searchers had stopped, which the dog handler attributed to wind and precipitation disrupting the scent trail. It had not snowed since December 22nd. There was no wind to speak of inside the fir canopy. I was 9 years old and I knew that was not a satisfying explanation, but I was 9 years old and nobody was asking me. On January 6th, 1959, 12 days after the girls disappeared, the Skamania County Sheriff officially suspended the active search. The case was listed as 2 missing persons, presumed deceased due to exposure. Carl and Edna Voss did not accept that conclusion. They never accepted it. Carl posted reward notices in the Stevenson Pioneer, the Carson newsletter, and as far away as the Columbian newspaper in Vancouver. Edna wrote to the state governor's office twice. Neither of them received any meaningful response. Carl Voss died in 1967 of a heart attack at the age of 49. He never stopped believing his daughters were alive. Edna moved to Portland to live with her sister after Carl died. She died in 1974. I went to her funeral. She was 61 years old and she had aged the way only people who carry unspeakable grief age, all at once, as if the weight of it compressed time itself. I stood at her graveside and I made a private promise that I intended to keep, though I had no idea at the time how I was going to keep it.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
That same year, 1974, I finished my degree in forest ecology at Washington State University in Pullman and accepted a position as a field technician with the Pacific Northwest Research Station, which managed the Wind River Experimental Forest in Skamania County. I came back to the same valley where I had grown up, where Ruth and Clara Voss had vanished 16 years earlier, and I started doing what I was trained to do. I started paying attention to the forest. The winter of 1958 left marks. In 1980, 1 year after the formal conclusion of the 3-year period in which I had made my 11 initial visits to the clearing, I received a message at my home address from Ruth. The message was in an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Stevenson, Washington, which told me she had found a way to get someone in the valley to mail something for her, or, more likely, had placed it in the outgoing mail at the Wind River Ranger Station on a day when the station was unoccupied and the mail was simply picked up, which was how rural Forest Service mail worked in 1980, without oversight or security. The letter was short. It was written in Ruth's handwriting on the same unlined white paper I had been leaving in the cache, which told me this was paper I had given her and that she had been saving for exactly this purpose. She said she wanted to tell me something that the bench visits had not allowed for adequate treatment of, which was the question of what she understood the family's awareness of the broader world to be. Not of the Carson community, not of the Wind River nursery housing, but of the world in the scale of a world. She said, "I want you to know that they are not unaware of what is happening beyond the drainage. They understand that the world they are adjacent to is changing in ways that have consequences for them. Eric has communicated this to me clearly enough that I am not uncertain about it. He is not naive. He knows what industrial logging has done to the forest ranges to the south and west, and he understands that those ranges were not empty before the logging. He knows what the road network has done to the isolation that the upper drainages depended on. He knows, I think, that the future will require accommodation that the past did not require. And he is preparing for that, though what preparing looks like I cannot fully tell you." She said, "He is not afraid. I want to be clear about that. What I would describe is something more like a long-term strategic patience, a willingness to let time work on problems that cannot be forced to resolution. He has been patient across timescales that make human strategic patience look brief, and that patience is not passive. It is active. It is the same quality in him that I noticed the first night when he sat down in the snow on the slope above the ravine and waited. He was being active in his waiting. He was making a choice, and the choice was to let time work." This was 1980. The Mount St. Helens eruption happened in May of that same year. On the 18th of May, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake, triggering the collapse of the summit and north flank in the largest landslide in recorded North American history, and the subsequent eruption that reshaped 230 square miles, cascade terrain, and killed 57 people. The Wind River drainage is approximately 40 miles east of Mount St. Helens, far enough to be outside the devastation zone but close enough that the ashfall was significant. Half an inch to an inch of ash across the upper Gifford Pinchot terrain in the weeks following the eruption, the air quality severely degraded, the forest canopy dusted white, the creek drainages running gray with suspended volcanic material for months. I went into the upper drainage 6 weeks after the eruption, in late June, on a field assignment to document ash deposition and initial ecosystem response in the old-growth stands. The forest looked like something from a different world, the normally dark green canopy of the Douglas fir showing pale gray where the ash had settled on the upper surfaces of the needles, the understory flattened in places by the weight of wet ash from the first post-eruption rainstorms, the creek running a color that had no precedent in my 17 years of observing it. I went to the bench. I left the stone arrangement that indicated I was asking for contact. 3 days later, on my second visit to the drainage that week, Ruth was there. She looked, for the first time in all the years I had known her in the forest, shaken, not frightened, not grieving, but shaken, in the specific way that very large natural events shake people, not with the shock of the unexpected, but with the shock of scale, of standing in the presence of a force that recalibrates your sense of what forces are possible. She told me the eruption had been experienced in the upper drainage as a sustained ground vibration that lasted for hours on the morning of the 18th, and then, as a darkness, not night darkness, but the darkness of the ash cloud moving east across the Cascades, blocking the sun, turning the morning to false evening in a way that lasted for most of the day. She said Eric had been outside well before dawn on the 18th, which she had not understood at the time but understood later, when the eruption happened, as a response to infrasound from the unstable mountain that his senses had detected and that had woken him hours before any audible or seismic event reached the upper drainage. She said the family had moved in the days immediately after the eruption to a higher bench further north, above the ash deposition zone, and had stayed there for 2 weeks while the worst of the air quality effects worked through the drainage. She said this was not the first time the family had moved in response to a volcanic event in the Cascades, that there were drawings on the rock face she had shown me that she now understood to represent eruption events, the specific form of the cloud and the directional ash fall, which she had not been able to interpret until she had seen a real eruption and could map the abstracted representation onto the experience. She said, "He has seen this before, or someone in his family has. The drawings are not imagination, they are memory." The volcano's memory, encoded on a basalt cliff face 40 miles east of the summit, in iron oxide pigment applied by a hand that had been paying attention for longer than any written record in the Pacific Northwest extends. I went back to the drawing site twice in the year after the eruption, and I looked at the images she had said represented volcanic events. I had seen them before, without knowing what I was seeing. Now I saw them, the cloud shape, highly stylized but directional, with a cone figure below it that was unmistakably a mountain, the ash fall indicated by a field of small marks below the cloud. In one image, figures, the elongated figures that I understood as representations of the family, shown in movement away from the ash zone, in the posture of evacuation that Ruth had described from the weeks after May 18th. Some of those images were old enough that the pigment's edges had softened into the surrounding rock. Whatever volcanic event they were recording was not Mount St. Helens in 1980. It was an earlier eruption, possibly centuries earlier, recorded by someone who had been there and had survived and had chosen to record the experience in the only archival medium available to them. They had been here through previous eruptions. They had recorded them. They had survived them and moved and come back. They were going to be here through whatever came next, on the community that did not fade the way most events fade. When you are 9 years old and your best friend disappears, the disappearance does not occupy a discrete compartment in your memory. It becomes structural. It becomes part of the architecture through which you understand everything else that happens to you. Every loss I experienced in the years after December of 1958 was filtered through that first loss. Every time something I cared about disappeared from my life, I felt, beneath the specific grief, the older grief, the one I had not been old enough to fully process, the one that had no resolution, the one whose open end remained open for 19 years. My parents handled it the way rural parents of that era handled the unexplainable things that happened in their community, which was with a public acceptance of the official conclusion and a private persistence of doubt that they never named out loud and never entirely suppressed. My father went back to his timber surveys. My mother went back to her garden and her root cellar, and the particular efficiency with which she managed the material life of our household. But I noticed, in the years after, a small change in each of them. My father began including me in his timber walks earlier than he probably would have otherwise, bringing me along to traverse lines in the old-growth sections as young as 11 or 12, teaching me to use a compass and a topographic map earlier than most children of my generation learned those things. I understood later that this was partly pleasure, because he enjoyed my company, and partly something else, which was that having me in the forest where he could see me and teach me to read the terrain was easier to bear than having me somewhere he could not see me. My mother became more specific about where I went and with whom and when I would return. Not in the way of fearfulness, not with anxiety that imposed itself on my freedom. She was not a fearful woman, and she understood that mountain children need to move through mountain terrain or they will not know it when they need to. But there was a precision to her accounting that had not been there before, and I understood even as a child that this precision was an act of love, and that the love had been refined by loss. I carried Ruth with me through the rest of childhood and through adolescence, and into my undergraduate years at WSU, where I studied forest ecology not because I had planned to, but because the summer between my junior and senior years of high school, I had worked a volunteer position on a Forest Service trail crew in the Gifford Pinchot and had understood, in the specific and irreversible way that you understand a vocation, that this was what I was going to do with my life. The forest was the place where I thought most clearly. The forest was the place where Ruth had gone. I was not romantic about the connection. I was not the kind of person who confused symbolic acts with practical ones, but I was honest enough with myself to note that choosing to spend my professional life in the same terrain where my best friend had disappeared was not a coincidence, and that the research I was most drawn to in my graduate work was old-growth ecosystem documentation in the remote drainages of the southern Washington Cascades, which was not where most of my cohort was focusing their attention. My graduate advisor at WSU, a man named Dr. Franklin Brandt, who was one of the finest plant ecologists I have ever known, once asked me why I was so focused on the old-growth sections of the Gifford Pinchot when the more productive research was happening in the logged overlands where the recovery dynamics were interesting and the comparisons were tractable. I told him I was interested in what undisturbed systems looked like at century-scale equilibrium, which was true. I did not tell him the other truth, which was that I believed, in a way I could not then articulate, and would not have wanted to, that the undisturbed old-growth terrain of the southern Cascades was a place where something remained that had not remained anywhere else, and that the remaining of it had something to do with Ruth and Clara Voss, and that the only way I was going to understand any of it was to go into the undisturbed terrain and stay long enough for whatever was there to decide I was trustworthy. Dr. Brandt gave me the fieldwork assignment I wanted. He was generous that way. He trusted his students' instincts, even when he did not fully understand the reasoning behind them, which is a quality of rare value in an academic advisor and one that I have spent my career trying to emulate. By 1974, I had been curious about what the forest science community was calling Sasquatch encounters for about 3 years. This was not the cultural obsession it would later become. 1974 was 2 years before the publication of Grover Krantz's first serious academic work on the subject, and most credentialed researchers who expressed any interest in the topic did so quietly and at some professional risk. But the Pacific Northwest had a long history of documented encounters, and the Wind River area specifically had generated several reports in the 1960s and early 70s that I had access to through the Forest Service internal documentation system. I want to be precise about what those reports contained, because I am going to need you to hold that information alongside everything else I am about to tell you. Between 1962 and 1973, the Wind River Ranger District received 9 separate incident reports describing encounters with what witnesses variously described as a very large, upright walking figure covered in dark hair, or extremely large footprints in remote terrain, or in 2 cases, the sound of a vocalization that no one could attribute to any known animal. 5 of the 9 reports came from experienced Forest Service personnel. 2 came from timber survey crews. 1 came from a hunting party. 1 came from a woman who lived alone in a cabin about 4 miles up the Wind River Road and who had lived there for 20 years without filing any complaints or incident reports of any kind before or after that one. None of these reports mentioned the Voss girls. None of them mentioned anything that connected to the disappearance of December 1958. I am not suggesting a connection at that point in my story. I am telling you what I knew when I returned to the Wind River Valley, because what you know shapes what you see, and I want you to understand exactly what I was seeing and why. I worked at the Wind River Experimental Forest from 1974 until 1991, 17 years. I eventually became a senior field researcher, specializing in old-growth ecosystem documentation, which is a job that requires you to spend a great deal of time in remote, rarely visited terrain carrying a clipboard and a set of calipers and paying the kind of sustained attention to your surroundings that most people never develop. I knew the Wind River drainage the way you only know a place after walking it in every season for years. I knew which drainages held water through dry August and which went intermittent in July. I knew where the elk bedded in January and where they moved to in March. I knew the sound profile of the forest at 2 in the morning in November, which is as close to total silence as the natural world produces, and I knew exactly when that profile was disturbed by something that should not have been there. The first time I noticed that disturbance was in October of 1975, 14 months after I had returned to the valley. I was doing a vegetation transect on a steep northwest-facing slope about 7 miles up the Wind River Road, in an area of old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar that had not been logged since before the Forest Service was established. The trees in that stand were 400 to 600 years old. The largest ones had trunk diameters of 8 to 10 feet. The canopy closed overhead at about 200 feet, and below it, the light was green and filtered and permanent, the same at noon as it was at 4 in the afternoon. It was a quiet place in the specific way that old forest is quiet, not empty, but full of small sounds that together create a texture of silence. Birds moving in the canopy, water over rock in the drainage 60 feet below, the occasional pop and tick of cooling wood in the late afternoon. What I heard on that October afternoon was not any of those things. It came from the slope above me, maybe 150 feet uphill and to my north, and it was a single impact sound, not a branch falling, not a tree shifting, but a percussive thud that communicated weight and intention in a way I could not explain then and can explain only partially now. It was a stone striking another stone, not the incidental sound of rock settling in a drainage or frost loosening material from a cliff face. A deliberate strike, one rock against another, the same interval repeated 3 times. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The forest around me had gone quiet, in the way it goes quiet when something large is present, and the smaller animals have processed that information before the human does. 3 minutes passed, 5. And then, from the same direction but further away, perhaps 300 feet uphill, the sound repeated. 3 strikes, same interval. I did not go uphill to investigate. I want to be honest about that. I was a 36-year-old woman alone on a steep slope 7 miles from the nearest road, and whatever was making that sound was substantially larger than anything I wanted to encounter in that terrain. I completed my transect and I walked out, but I noted it in my field journal with the date, the time, the location by topographic landmark, and my best description of the sound. I have that journal still. The entry is dated October 9th, 1975. Over the next 18 months, I recorded 11 more incidents in that same general area. An elevated drainage basin about 6 to 8 miles up the Wind River Road, north of what the topo maps call the Trapper Creek drainage, in old-growth terrain that received no recreational traffic and very little Forest Service activity. 2 of the incidents were the stone-striking sound I had first heard in October of 75. 4 were the presence of very large footprints in soft ground or creek margin mud. I measured the clearest of these at 17.5 inches in length with a stride interval of approximately 72 inches, which I confirmed by taking plaster casts that I still have in a storage unit in Stevenson. 3 incidents were olfactory, a distinctive smell that I can only describe as a combination of musk and wet earth and something ferrous, like blood but not blood, a smell that was not attached to any visible animal and that appeared and dissipated without apparent source. And 2 incidents were auditory in a different way from the stone striking, a vocalization at distance and at night that I recorded on a portable audio recorder I began carrying after the 3rd footprint find. The recording is not professionally usable, but the sound it captured is unlike any known species in the Pacific Northwest, and I had it reviewed by an ornithologist colleague named Dr. Patricia Hove at Washington State University, who confirmed that it did not match any bird species she was aware of, and by a mammalian biologist at the University of Washington, who said the same. None of this told me what I was dealing with. What it told me was that something was using that drainage basin regularly over an extended period of time, was aware of my presence when I was there, and had not chosen to move away from the area despite the fact that I was visiting it regularly. That last detail is the one that occupied my thinking the most. Whatever was in that drainage had made a calculation about me, and the calculation it had arrived at was that I was not a threat. I was not certain I deserved that assessment, but I had not done anything to contradict it, and I had the presence of mind not to. In March of 1977, and I need you to hold that date very carefully, because 1977 is 18 years after the December of 1958 when Ruth and Clara Voss disappeared. I was conducting a late winter vegetation survey in the upper drainage north of the Trapper Creek confluence. The snowpack that year was substantial. A storm in February had dropped nearly 3 feet in the upper elevations, and by March the Wind River Road was still closed above mile marker 12, which meant I had skied in from the closure gate, a distance of about 4 miles. On the cross-country skis I kept in my truck for exactly that kind of access. I was comfortable on skis. I had grown up on skis. My father had taught me to ski the same hill above the nursery housing where the Voss girls had last been seen. The day was clear and cold, about 22 degrees, at 8 in the morning when I set out, warming to perhaps 31 by midday. The sky was the particular hard blue that comes when high pressure settles over the Cascades in late winter, and the snow surface was firm and fast in the early morning, softening by mid-afternoon to a heavy crust that grabbed at the ski edges. I was moving up the drainage along the east bank of the creek, which in March was running fast and clear under a snow bridge that I had crossed carefully by probing the surface ahead of me with my ski pole. I was about 6 miles up from the road closure, which put me in the old-growth section I had been monitoring for the previous 18 months. I smelled them before I heard them or saw them. The smell I had documented before, musk and earth, and that ferrous note, came to me from the west, from across the creek, carried on a light upslope wind that was moving north through the drainage as the day warmed. I stopped skiing. I stood still. The smell was stronger than I had encountered before, which meant the source was closer than it had previously been, or there were more sources, or both. Then I heard a voice, a human voice, a woman's voice. It was not calling out. It was not yelling for help. It was speaking, conversationally, at a volume just above the sound of the creek. And what it said, I am going to quote this precisely because I have repeated it to myself 10,000 times in the 47 years since, was, "You do not need to worry. She has seen us before." The voice was calm. It was adult. It was speaking in English with no accent I could place. And it was coming from the other side of the creek, from within the tree canopy, from a direction that my topographic memory told me was a low bench above the creek bank, a flat spot of maybe an acre that I had noted in my field maps as a possible winter bedding area for elk due to its wind protection and southern exposure. I did not move for what I estimate was 4 minutes. I stood on my skis in the middle of the drainage, with my field pack on my back, and the smell in my nose, and that sentence in my ears, and I processed what I knew. There should not have been a human being in that drainage. The road had been closed for 5 weeks. The terrain was not accessible without either skis or snowshoes, and nobody I knew of was permitted or scheduled to be in that area. I was the only person with an active field assignment in that drainage that winter. She has seen us before. That sentence meant someone on the other side of that creek knew I was there, and that someone had spoken those words to reassure something or someone else. I had spoken them in response to a concern that my presence had raised in another party. The pronoun she told me I was the subject of the reassurance, which meant someone over there knew who I was. I unclipped my ski bindings because I could not move quietly on skis, and I stepped off the trail onto the snow surface, which held my weight in the crusted morning pack. I moved toward the creek. I moved slowly, and I made no sudden gestures with my hands, which is what you do around animals that might interpret sudden movement as aggression, and I am aware that I have just told you I was treating this situation like an animal encounter, which should tell you something about what my body understood before my mind had caught up. I crossed the creek on the snow bridge, testing with my pole, and I came up the east bank onto the bench above it, and I stopped. There were 3 figures in the clearing. They were standing about 40 feet from me, in the shadow of the tree canopy, where the old-growth fir blocked the sunlight, and I am going to describe what I saw as precisely as I can because I know that precision is the only currency I have in telling this story. The first figure was a woman. She was standing upright, dressed in layered animal hide, not roughly made, but constructed with evident skill. The edges clean, and the seams tight. She was wearing what appeared to be moccasins that extended to mid-calf, and a hood made from what I later understood to be elk hide pulled back from her face. She was perhaps 5 feet 4 inches tall. Her hair was brown, long, and braided back. Her face was familiar to me in a way that I did not immediately understand, the way a face can be familiar when you have known it in a younger version and are now seeing it older. She was watching me with no fear and no particular surprise, as if she had been expecting me, or at least expecting something like me. She was the one who had spoken. She looked about 30 years old. Ruth Voss had been 11 in December of 1958. She would have been 29 years old in March of 1977. Standing beside her, perhaps 2 feet to her left, was a second woman. She was shorter, perhaps 5 feet 1, and younger looking, though not by as much as the age difference between Ruth and Clara Voss would have suggested. She had the same dark brown hair and the same broad-faced, high-cheeked structure as the first woman. She was also dressed in hide clothing. She was holding a child by the hand. The child was perhaps 3 years old, heavily bundled in what appeared to be layers of woven plant material and fur, and was staring at me with the unself-conscious, unguarded curiosity that small children have before they learn to be cautious. And behind them, at the edge of the tree line where the old-growth fir began and the light dropped away entirely, was the third figure. I am going to try to describe this accurately, and I am going to resist the temptation to use language that makes it sound more dramatic than it was, because the truth of it is dramatic enough without embellishment. The third figure was large. I will not guess at a precise height, because height estimation under a tree canopy at 40 feet is not reliable, but I will tell you that its head was level with branches I knew from years of working in that stand to be approximately 9 feet from the ground. It was broad across the chest and shoulders in a proportion that did not match any human body I had seen or imagined. It was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, though that is the closest word in English, over most of its visible surface, with the face and the palms of its hands showing darker, less haired skin. Its eyes, which were watching me from the shadow with an attention that I felt physically in my chest, were a dark amber color that caught what little light filtered through the canopy. It was standing still. Both hands were visible at its sides. It was not crouching or positioning itself in any way that suggested preparation for movement. It was simply standing there, watching me, and I was watching it, and in that 40 feet of winter forest between us was 19 years of questions and grief, and a promise I had made at a graveside in Portland in 1974. Ruth Voss. And I knew, I absolutely knew, that was who this woman was. Even before she told me, said, "I know who you are, Dorothy. You've been coming up this drainage for 2 years. I did not know it was you until last fall." I said something back. I do not remember exactly what. I think I said her name. I think I said it quietly. The way you say a name when you are afraid that saying it too loudly will make the moment dissolve. She said yes. I stood there in the snow on that bench above the Wind River with the smell of the forest around me, and the child watching me from behind her mother's leg, and the immense figure at the tree line doing whatever it does when it decides whether you are trustworthy. And I started to cry. I did not try to stop it. There was no point. Ruth said, "Clara is fine. She is at the other shelter. She has a son." Ruth, she has a son. I want to stop here and tell you what I did not do, because I think it is important. I did not immediately tell anyone. I did not go back to the Forest Service station and file a report. I did not contact the Skamania County Sheriff's Department. I did not call a newspaper or a university or any of the other institutions that a person in my position might have been expected to contact. What I did was stand in that clearing for the next 3 hours and listen to Ruth Voss tell me everything she could tell me about the 19 years she had been gone. And then I skied out, and I sat in my truck on the road for 45 minutes, and then I drove home. The reason I'm telling you about the decision I made that afternoon is that it was the most consequential decision of my life, and I want to explain it rather than simply assert it. I was a Forest Service employee with a professional obligation to report significant discoveries in the lands I monitored. I was the oldest living person who had known Ruth and Clara Voss personally. I was aware that their parents were dead and that no official body was actively looking for them, and that the only official record of their existence in that drainage was a 19-year-old missing persons case that was listed as presumed deceased. I was also aware, standing in that clearing, that the large figure at the tree line had not moved, had not threatened me, had allowed me to stand within 40 feet of 2 women and a small child and have a conversation, and that this represented a level of trust that could be destroyed in an instant by the wrong decision on my part. I made the decision to protect what I had found rather than report it. I made it consciously and with full understanding of what it would cost me if it ever came to light. And I have lived with that decision without regret for 47 years. I want to explain why, and I am going to do that by telling you what Ruth told me on that bench above the Wind River in March of 1977. Ruth Voss told me that on December 26, 1958, she and Clara had been sledding on the hill above the nursery housing and had decided, the way children decide things, impulsively, with absolute confidence in their own competence, to sled the longer run that began in the clearing just inside the tree line. They had done this run twice before on previous snow years, always in the afternoon, always with older children present. On that December afternoon, they did it alone, without telling anyone. The run inside the trees was steeper and faster than the open hill. And on that day, with 2 feet of densely packed snow on the ground, it was faster than either of them had experienced before. The sled left the defined track after about 100 yards and went sideways into a shallow ravine where the snow had drifted 4 feet deep against a fallen log, and both girls went into the drift and the sled stopped and Ruth pulled herself out of the snow and then pulled Clara out, and Clara was crying and Ruth was trying to calm her down. And they were doing what children do in that situation, trying to orientate themselves and make a plan. When they heard a sound, Ruth described the sound the way everyone who has heard it describes it. Wrong. Not wrong in the sense of frightening, initially. Wrong in the sense of scale. Too deep, too resonant, produced by a chest that was simply larger than any chest she had encountered. It came from uphill of them, maybe 50 or 60 feet, in the direction of the denser old growth where the trees became large enough that their canopy blocked out the remaining afternoon light. Clara grabbed Ruth's arm. Ruth told her to be quiet. They stood in the ravine next to the overturned sled and listened. What happened next, Ruth told me, took about 3 minutes. The sound came again, closer, and then she saw it. Him, she corrected herself. Him, moving through the trees above them. Moving, she said, deliberately. Not toward them, not away from them, but across the slope in a traverse that brought him into a position about 30 feet uphill where the trees thinned enough that she could see him clearly against the snow. He was looking at them. He was not moving. He was just looking. Clara made a sound, a small, involuntary cry, and Ruth put her arm around her sister's shoulders and held her. And then the figure did something that Ruth said she had thought about nearly every day of the 19 years since. He sat down in the snow on the slope above them, not in the posture of an animal settling into ambush, but in the way a person sits, back upright, forearms resting on his knees, and he looked at them, and he waited. Ruth told me he was watching them with what she could only call patience, and that after several minutes of this, of him sitting in the snow on that slope, while two small girls stood in a drift 30 feet below him. She felt the fear leave her, and what replaced it was something she could not name at age 11 and could only partially name at 29. She said it was the feeling of being seen without being evaluated, of being looked at by something that had no agenda in the looking. She said she put her mittened hand against Clara's face and turned her sister to look at the same thing she was looking at, and Clara made a sound. Ruth had never heard her make before, or since. Not a cry, not a laugh, but something between them, and Ruth thought, "It is all right." She did not know why she thought it. She thought it anyway. They could not get back up the slope. The ravine they had fallen into was steep on 3 sides, and the snow was too deep and too soft to climb. Ruth tried twice and sank to her waist both times. The temperature was dropping. It had been perhaps 3 in the afternoon when they went into the trees. By the time she understood, they could not climb out. It was getting dark. The figure on the slope had not moved. Ruth said she looked up at him and said out loud, in the gathering dark, that they needed help. She said it plainly, the way you say something to a person when you have decided to trust them and do not know yet if the trust is warranted. He stood up, he came down the slope toward them, and Ruth held Clara's hand and did not look away. And he came to the edge of the ravine above them and he reached down, and Ruth described his arm as simply enormous, longer than any human arm. Longer by far, reaching down over the edge of the ravine without him needing to kneel or lean. And he held out his hand. The hand was open, palm up. Ruth put her hand in his. He lifted both of them out of that ravine without apparent effort, in 2 motions, and then he picked up the flexible flyer sled. Ruth said he carried it in one hand, the whole thing, like a tray, and he moved uphill through the trees, and they followed him because there was nothing else to do, and also because Ruth, at 11 years old, had already decided something about this situation that she would spend the next 19 years living out. She had decided they were safe. He took them to a shelter. Ruth used that word carefully when she described it to me. Not a cave, she said. Not a den. A shelter, built intentionally. Large logs notched together at the corners in a way that reminded her of the log buildings she had seen in pictures of the old homestead era, but larger, and set into the slope of a hillside, so that the hill itself formed the back wall. The interior was dry and warm. The warmth was not from a fire. There was no fire inside, but from the massed body heat of the 3 individuals who lived there, all of whom she eventually understood to be a family, a mated pair and a younger male who was, Ruth judged, somewhere in adolescence, though he was already substantially larger than any adult human man she had ever seen. Ruth told me this carefully. She said she wanted me to understand what she had walked into in that shelter in December of 1958, because she said most people's minds, when she tried to explain it, went immediately to horror and dread, and what she had actually experienced was neither of those things. What she had experienced was a household, a domestic space with the same organizational logic as any other household she had known, sleeping areas arranged away from the entrance, food stores on the coldest side of the structure, tools near the work area. The tools she described, I am going to tell you this exactly, were made from stone and bone and wood, and they were not crude. They were specific, a series of scrapers of graduated sizes, and all for working hide. Several cutting implements that she described as resembling ulus, the the mother of that family, for that was what she was, Ruth told me, as plainly as any mother she had known, made a nest of hides in the corner away from the entrance and indicated, with a gesture that required no translation, that it was for the girls. Ruth helped Clara into it. Clara was exhausted and frightened and hungry, and within 20 minutes of lying down in that warm space, with those hides piled over her, she was asleep. Ruth did not sleep. Ruth sat in that shelter for the rest of the night and watched. She told me what she saw was a family going about the business of evening in the way that families do. The young male, The adolescent came in late, carrying what Ruth identified as a large fish, which the mother cleaned with the basalt blade in a series of practiced motions that Ruth said took less than 4 minutes for a fish that must have weighed 8 pounds. Portions of it were set aside, wrapped in leaves. Some of it was placed near a flat stone near the entrance, which Ruth later understood was heated by a small external fire that could not be seen from inside the shelter but whose warmth came through the stone. This was how they cooked. Not with open flame in the sleeping space, with conducted heat from outside. The father, and this is the word Ruth used, father, without hesitation or qualification, sat with his back against the rear wall and watched his family. He watched them the way some fathers watch their families, which is a particular way that is hard to describe to someone who has not had it directed at them, and it contains both vigilance and tenderness in equal measure, and it is the look of something that will not allow harm to come to the people in its care. At some point in the night he looked at Ruth across the shelter and she held his gaze, and she said she felt, again, that sense of being seen without being evaluated. "This is going to be my life now." She told me she did not think it with grief. She told me she thought it the way you think a true thing, straight and clear, without the noise of wishing it were otherwise. She did not try to leave in the night. She made that decision consciously. She told me she thought about it. She thought, I could try to find my way down in the dark and in the cold, and I would not find my way, and Clara would be alone here, and I would be dead before morning. She was 11 years old, and she was reasoning with that kind of clarity, which tells you something about who Ruth Voss was even at 11. Then she thought, or I can stay and see what this is. She stayed. The following morning, the father led them, both girls, to the crest of the ridge above the shelter, from which, on a clear morning, they could see the Wind River Valley below and the Columbia River beyond it, and the town of Carson as a cluster of small buildings against the white ground. And Ruth said she understood then how far they had come overnight. The valley floor was more than 1,000 feet below them, and the slopes were as steep as anything she had navigated on skis. And without someone who knew the routes through that terrain, she and Clara could not have descended. This was not a threat. He had brought them to the crest specifically to show them where they were, which she understood as a gesture of honesty. Here is where you are. I am not hiding it from you. She said she looked at the valley for a long time. She looked at the nursery housing where her family lived. She thought about her parents. She thought about Edna, specifically, and about how Edna would respond to this. And then she turned around and followed the father back down to the shelter. I asked her, standing on that bench above the Wind River 29 years after that morning on the ridge, why she had turned around. Ruth said, because Clara was already in love with them. She said it simply. She said Clara had woken up that second morning in a different condition than she had fallen asleep in the night before. Clara had woken up with the particular alertness that children have when they are in the presence of something that delights them and they do not know yet that they are supposed to be afraid of it. She had already made friends with the young male, who was apparently willing to sit for extended periods while a small girl touched his hands and examined his fingers, which she did with the focused attention of a child conducting a science experiment. Ruth said the young male submitted to this examination with a patience that she found both striking and funny, and that at some point he had done something with his fingers, folded them in some particular sequence, and Clara had laughed with the full-body laugh of an 8-year-old. And Ruth had heard that laugh from outside the shelter, where she was standing on the ridge above the valley, and she had thought, all right. She had thought, all right. I need to tell you now about the second winter, and the third, and the slow progress of what Ruth described as a reordering of everything she had previously understood about the world. I need to tell you this not because I think it will convince you of anything. I know that stories like this do not work by convincing. They work by accumulating until something gives way. but because I made Ruth a promise that day on the bench above the Wind River, the same kind of promise I had made at Edna Voss's graveside 3 years before. And that promise was to tell this story fully, without editing out the parts that are difficult or the parts that do not fit, and to trust that the people who need to hear it will hear it. In the first spring, the father, Ruth eventually came to think of him by a name she gave him, a name from a book she had loved at age 10 about a sea captain, and the name was Eric, and I am going to use that name because it is the name Ruth used with me. Eric began teaching the girls the terrain, not in the way of a jailer showing prisoners the walls, in the way of someone who understood that the people in his care needed to know where they were and what was possible in the landscape and what was not. He showed them the drainage routes that led to lower elevation. He showed them the routes that dead-ended at cliff faces. He showed them the creek crossings that were safe in spring runoff and the ones that were not. He showed them, twice, the route that would have taken them back to the Wind River Road. Ruth said she understood the showing of that route as a door that he was deliberately leaving open. It was never barred. She could have taken it. Either of them could have taken it at any point in those 19 years. And she believed, she told me she was certain, that Eric would not have followed them. "So why didn't you?" I asked her. She was quiet for a moment. She looked toward the tree line where Eric was standing, and then she looked back at me. And she said, "By the time I understood the door was open, I did not want to go through it." She said this the way you say something that is both true and complicated, where the truth of it is clean but the complication of it is endless. She said that what had happened to her sense of what the world was, of what was possible and what was actual, was too large to compress back into the shape it had been. She said she had learned things in those 19 years that she could not unlearn, and that the life she would have returned to would have required her to pretend she had not learned them, and she had no interest in living that pretense. She said, also, I was not willing to leave Clara. And she said, and I was not willing to leave Eric. I am going to be direct about what that last sentence meant, because I think clarity serves everyone better than implication in a story like this. By the time I found them in March of 1977, Ruth had been with Eric for 19 years. The child I had seen when I first arrived on the bench, the small, heavily bundled child holding Clara's hand, was Ruth's child. His name was a sound that Ruth rendered in English approximately as Ren, and he was 3 years old. And he was the single most remarkable person I have ever met, for reasons I will get to. Clara had a son as well, 2 years older than Ren, and he was being looked after in the second shelter that Clara and her partner, a younger male, unmated when the girls had arrived and now fully grown, shared about 1.5 miles further up the drainage. I want to be precise about how Ruth described the nature of her relationship with Eric, because I think this matters, and because I think people have a tendency to either romanticize or horrify something they cannot categorize, and neither response serves the truth. She described it as a partnership. She used that word. She said it had not begun as one, that in the beginning she had been a child in his care, and that the passage from that to something different had been gradual and deliberate and mutual, and that by the time she was old enough for there to be a question of what their relationship was, the question had already been answered by years of living alongside each other in a way that made the question feel small. She said she wanted me to understand that there had been nothing abrupt or violent about any of it, and I believed her, and I believe her still. She said he was patient in a way that had no parallel in her experience. She said he communicated in ways that did not require language, but that were never ambiguous. She said he was, above everything else, attentive, that she had never in her life before or since been in the presence of something that paid attention the way he paid attention, not just to the forest, and to threat, and to the management of food and territory, but to her specifically, to what she needed and did not need, and was afraid of, and delighted by. She said living with that quality of attention had changed her in ways she could not articulate. except to say that she had never felt alone, that in 19 years in the most remote forest in southwestern Washington, she had never felt the particular loneliness of being unseen. She told me all of this while we stood on the bench above the Wind River in the March cold, with the snow around us and the creek below us and Eric at the edge of the tree line, watching. She told it to me the way she had probably been composing it in her mind for years, because she was not a person who left things unexamined. She was Ruth Voss. She had been examining everything she could reach since she was old enough to understand that examination was a choice. At some point during that conversation, Ren came and stood next to his mother. He had come out of the tree line from the direction of Eric, which told me he had been with his father and had been sent, or had chosen to come, to see the visitor. He stood at Ruth's hip and looked up at me, and I looked down at him. And I want to tell you about Ren with as much precision as I can, because he was the thing that made the scientific implications of this story inescapable. Ren was 3 years old. He was the size of a child of perhaps 6, with the physical proportion of his father's people, wide through the chest and shoulders, heavy-limbed, but his face was Ruth's, not resembling Ruth's face, scaled down and placed on a broader skull with the same amber-colored eyes that his father had, the same dark, reflective depth in them. He was covered on his arms and the backs of his hands in a fine, dark hair that was denser than human body hair but not as dense as his father's, and his skin, where it was visible, was a warm brown with a slight reddish undertone. His feet were bare in the snow. He did not appear to notice the cold. He looked at me with those amber eyes and he said, in English, completely clearly, "My mother says you are from down the hill." I said, "Yes, that was right." He said, "She says you knew her when she was small." I said, "Yes." I said I had been her best friend. He thought about this for a moment. The visible, deliberate thinking of a small child processing new information. And then he said, "Then you can come back." Ruth told me he had never said anything like that to a human before, that in 3 years she had not brought any human being to the clearing, that the only reason I was standing there was that she had recognized me from a distance on one of my field surveys the previous fall, and had tracked my movements for several months before deciding to speak to me. "Tracked your movements," she said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. And given what her life had been for 19 years, I suppose it was. I went back 11 times over the following 2 years, always alone, always on foot or skis, always on the days when my field assignment gave me legitimate reason to be in that drainage. I brought things they asked for, books, primarily, which Ruth requested with the specificity of someone who has been without them and has been keeping a running list in her head, medical reference texts, a Gray's Anatomy, because she wanted to understand her children's biology and had no access to comparative material, field guides for the Pacific Northwest, though her knowledge of the local ecology was already more comprehensive than mine, 3 novels that she named specifically, Middlemarch, The Count of Monte Cristo, and a copy of Moby Dick, which she said had replaced the one she had read to pieces in the first decade and which she now read to Ren in the evenings. She told me Ren had been reading since he was 2. I want to be precise about something that I have circled around in this account without fully addressing, and that is the question of what Ruth and Clara's presence in that forest meant for their own biology over time. I am not a physician, but I spent 17 years in daily contact with the research community at the Wind River Experimental Forest, and I had access to the medical reference literature that Ruth had requested and that I had brought to her over the years, and I paid attention to what Ruth told me about herself and Clara in the health dimension of their lives, and what she told me was scientifically interesting in ways I cannot fully interpret but cannot ignore. Both women were, by every external indication I could observe over 30 years of visits, healthier than they had any right to be given the absence of conventional medical care. I do not mean merely functional. I mean genuinely, robustly healthy. better in most measurable ways than contemporaries of mine who had access to full medical care and lived in conditions far less demanding than a remote mountain forest at elevation. Ruth in her 60s had the posture and the lung capacity and the resting pulse rate of a woman 15 years younger. Clara, despite the cardiac condition that had concerned me in 2007, was alive and well in 2022 at the age of 73, which is not impossible, but is notable when you consider that she had received no formal medical treatment of any kind since the age of 8. I asked Ruth about this directly in one of our later visits. I no longer remember exactly which year, sometime in the late 1980s, and she was thoughtful about it in the way she was always thoughtful when I asked her about biology. She said, "I think the diet is part of it. We eat a broader range of plant material than most humans do, and more of it is seasonal and fresh, and some of it I am fairly certain has pharmacological properties that we are using without understanding fully. The family has been using certain plants in certain combinations for a very long time, and the combinations are not accidental," she said. "I also think the air is part of it. The air quality in the old-growth drainage is significantly different from what you breathe in the valley. The VOC profile is completely different. The terpene concentrations from the old-growth Douglas fir are measurable, and there is research suggesting that sustained exposure to forest terpenes has immune-modulating effects." She was referring to the research on phytoncides, the volatile organic compounds released by conifers that have been documented, particularly in the Japanese research tradition of Shinrin-yoku or forest bathing, as having measurable effects on natural killer cell activity and cortisol levels in humans who spend sustained time in forested environments. This research was not well known in English-language literature in the 1980s, but Ruth had read enough medical ecology literature to encounter it, and she had been living it for decades. She said, "And I think the third factor is harder to name. I think living with Eric and the family has changed something in my baseline physiology that I do not have a mechanism for. I have thought about this carefully, and I am not dismissing it because I have no mechanism. I am noting it because the evidence is too consistent over too many years to be coincidence. Clara and I are healthier than we should be. We were both strong children, but not extraordinary. What we have become is different from what our genetics would have predicted." She said this with the characteristic precision she brought to everything, stating clearly what she observed, stating clearly the limits of her interpretation, not claiming more than the evidence supported. And then she said something that I have thought about often since. She said, "I wonder if it is the same mechanism that makes the children what they are. Not genetics exactly, something that proximity does. Something that being in close contact with that level of health and that kind of body, with beings whose physiology is simply more robust than ours in almost every measurable way, does to the people around them. Whether that kind of adjacency has effects we have not thought to look for because we have never had a study group," she was speculating. Carefully and clearly labeled as speculation. But she had been the study group for over 30 years, and she was a careful observer, and I have thought about her hypothesis in the years since, and I find it more plausible, not less. As the research on microbiome transmission and epigenetic effects of environmental exposure has developed, we are not sealed systems. We are porous. We are changed by what we are in contact with, in ways that go well beyond what we can measure and that extend over timescales much longer than any study that has been funded or approved. Ruth has lived for 66 years in sustained, daily contact with beings whose immune systems and cardiovascular systems and musculoskeletal systems are constructed at a scale and a robustness that human biology does not approach. Whatever that contact has done to her, and the evidence is that it has done something, is a question that will not be answered in my lifetime or perhaps in any lifetime, because the study group is a secret and the secret is being kept, and I am the person keeping it. I asked her how that was possible. She said she did not know how it was possible. She said she had taught him the letters when he was 14 months old. Using a stick in the dirt, the way you might teach any toddler their alphabet, and he had retained every letter after a single exposure and had made the connection to phonemes within 2 weeks. She said his memory was absolute, not just strong, not just good, but complete, in the way that a recording is complete. She said he remembered in images and sounds, and she had learned to understand the difference between things he had witnessed and things he was recounting from memory by a particular quality in his eyes when he described them, a slight unfocusing that meant he was looking at the memory rather than at her. She told me that Eric's people communicated in part through infrasound, sub-auditory vibrations below the threshold of human hearing, which explained the humming sensation that various witnesses to encounters in the Pacific Northwest had described in their reports, and which I had twice noticed myself in the drainage and recorded in my field journal as an unexplained physical sensation. She told me that Ren could both produce and receive this infrasound, which meant he was communicating on 2 frequencies simultaneously when he spoke, in English audible to humans, and in the subsonic register of his father's people. She said this sometimes produced in the humans around him a feeling of emotional resonance without identifiable cause, a sense of being understood more fully than the words on their surface warranted. She said this carefully, watching my face as she said it. I thought about the moment Ren had looked at me and said I could come back, and I thought about the feeling that had come over me when he said it, which had been out of proportion to any 3-year-old's invitation under any normal circumstances. I thought, that child was talking to me on 2 frequencies, and I was hearing both of them. I did not share this thought with Ruth, but I think she knew I had thought it, because she changed the subject with the precise timing of someone who has made their point and does not need to underline it. I want to tell you about the drawing. In the summer of 1982, Ruth took me somewhere she had not taken me before. She had been building toward this for several visits, I understood in retrospect, asking me questions about what I thought I understood about the history of the old-growth timber in the drainage, about what the Forest Service records showed in terms of historical extent of the stands, about whether there was any archaeological documentation of the terrain north of the Trapper Creek confluence. I told her what I knew, which was limited. The Wind River Experimental Forest had been established in 1913 specifically because the area contained old-growth stands that could serve as research references for logged lands, and the scientific literature on the stand from the teens onward was fairly well documented. Before 1913, there was very little formal documentation. Before European settlement of the region, there was essentially nothing in the written record about the interior of the Gifford Pinchot terrain. She said, "Come with me." We walked north from the bench, through the old-growth section I had been working in since 1975, for about 45 minutes. The terrain climbed steeply in the first half of the walk and then leveled off onto a bench that was higher and more exposed than the one we usually used, with views east toward Mount Adams and south toward the Columbia River Gorge. The trees on this bench were larger than anything in the lower drainage, not taller, because the exposure limited height, but broader in trunk diameter, with the deeply furrowed bark of very old Douglas fir that had been growing here since before anyone who is now alive was born. Ruth led me to a section of cliff face at the north end of the bench, where the basalt was sheltered from the prevailing weather by an overhang. The cliff face was perhaps 30 feet wide and 15 feet high at the maximum, and it was covered in drawings. I have seen photographs of the Lascaux cave paintings. I have seen photographs of the pictographs along the Columbia River at Sagaglalal, the She Who Watches site at Horsethief Lake. I have seen the petroglyphs documented by anthropologists throughout the Pacific Northwest. I am telling you that what Ruth showed me on that cliff face was in the same register of quality as any of those, different in subject matter and in style, but equivalent in the precision of execution and the scale of ambition. The drawings were in iron oxide pigment on the rock, in shades from pale yellow to deep red to near black, and some had been gone over multiple times, the lines thickened and deepened by repeated application, suggesting that some of these were not single drawings, but palimpsests, images returned to and reworked over spans of time I could not estimate. The images showed animals, elk in winter coats and summer coats, identifiable by the relative proportions of their bodies and the antler configurations. Black-tailed deer, a species I could not immediately identify that Ruth said were the wolverines that had denned in the upper drainage within living memory of Eric's family. Fish in the stylized rendering of something seen from above and from the side simultaneously, a representation mode I had seen in Pacific Northwest indigenous art, but that here had a different quality, more observational and less symbolic, as if the maker had looked at the fish repeatedly from different angles and was trying to capture all the angles at once. There were landscapes. The valley below, identifiable by the shape of the ridgelines and the drainage pattern, rendered in a way that required an observer's position above and to the east, exactly the view from this bench, looking south. The valley in summer, identifiable by the density of the canopy rendering. The valley in what might have been winter, the lines sparser, the tree canopy shown as individual trees rather than a continuous mass. One landscape that I stared at for a long time because the ridgeline shape was familiar and the drainage pattern was familiar, but the valley floor looked different. Wider, the river channel broader, the forest heavier in the open areas between the established stands, as if the bench between the valley floor and the first ridgeline was more heavily wooded than it currently was. Ruth, watching me look, said, "That one is old." She did not mean a few decades. She said Eric had shown her this one first, of all the drawings on this cliff face, and that he had communicated to her through their shared vocabulary of gesture and accumulated exchange, that this particular landscape drawing showed the valley as it had been before the era of logging, not just before the industrial logging of the late 19th and early 20th century, but before any significant human modification of the valley floor. Ruth said he had communicated this by pointing at the drawing, and then pointing at the valley, and then making a gesture she understood as the gesture of subtracting, of showing her what was no longer there, the way you might indicate the absence of something that used to fill a space now empty. The trees had been larger. The valley floor had been more heavily canopied. The river channel was broader, indicating a higher base flow, which is consistent with what forest hydrologists have documented about the effects of old-growth forest removal on watershed function. Old-growth stands act as sponges, holding precipitation and releasing it slowly, maintaining consistent base flow in the streams that drain them. Remove the old growth and the base flow drops. The drawing was showing her a higher base flow river, a more heavily canopied valley, a landscape that would have taken at minimum several centuries of old-growth removal to transform into the valley we were looking at now. Ruth said, "He showed me this one first, not to make me feel sad, to make sure I understood what the valley is supposed to look like." I stood in front of that cliff face for 3 hours. Ruth sat on a flat rock behind me and read from a book she had brought. She always brought a book to these visits, tucked in the hide pack she carried for field work, and she let me have my 3 hours in front of the drawings in silence because she understood that what I was doing was not simply looking but absorbing, taking in something that my scientific training had not given me a category for, and that required time to find its category. What I understood by the end of those 3 hours was this: the drawings on that cliff face were a record. Not a record in the way that scientific field notes are records, with their dates and their measurements and their systematic structure. A record in the older sense of the word, which is the sense in which cave paintings are records and oral histories are records and the stars are records, things made by a mind that understood it would not persist forever and wanted what it knew to outlast it. These drawings were made by beings who understood that the valley they were drawing would change, that the trees would be cut and the river would narrow and the animals they were drawing would move or decline, and who drew anyway, and who kept drawing, and who returned to the drawings and deepened the lines and added new images until the cliff face was as full as a cliff face can be, and then kept going because there was more to record than any single surface could contain. I went back to that cliff face twice more in the years I was working in the drainage. Both times Ruth walked with me, and both times I stood in front of the drawings and thought about the mind that had made them, and about what it had understood about time, and about what it means to know that you are living in a world that is being unmade and to leave a record of what the world was. Eric made those drawings, or his ancestors did, and he continued them, and his children would continue them, and in that continuity was something I had no word for in English. A practice, a commitment, a refusal to let the forgetting be total. I thought about my father's field notebooks, which he kept meticulously for 30 years, and which I have in a box in my garage in Olympia. I thought about the impulse that made him keep them, not because anyone required him to, but because a surveyor who is paying close attention to old-growth forest understands, without being able to fully articulate it, that the attention should be recorded, that the noticing of things is most valuable when it can be transmitted to someone who was not there to notice. My father and Eric were doing the same thing, in different registers and for different durations, and neither of them would have recognized the commonality without the translation that Ruth had been living inside for 19 years, and that she then gave to me. In my 9th visit to that clearing, in the summer of 1978, I met Clara's partner. He had a name in the language of Eric's people that Clara rendered in English approximately as sorrow, which, she told me with a laugh, was not a sad name in the original, but a name relating to a particular quality of water, the way a deep pool in a creek holds its stillness even in fast current, and that she had chosen the English approximation that came closest to the emotional texture of the word rather than to its literal meaning. He was younger than Eric by what Clara estimated was 15 to 20 years, though she said age worked differently in this species and she was not certain her estimation was accurate. He was somewhat less broad than Eric, somewhat faster in his movements, with lighter-colored eyes, hazel rather than amber, and a temperament that Clara described as curious where Eric was watchful. Clara's son, whose English name was Thomas, Clara had insisted on giving him an English first name in addition to the name his father's people used, was 5 years old when I met him. He was built more heavily than Wren, closer to his father's proportions, but he had Clara's mouth and Clara's habit of smiling with his whole face the way Clara always had, and which I recognized across 20 years and across a physical form that I could not have imagined. He showed me his rock collection. He had a large, flat piece of basalt that served as a display surface and on which he had arranged approximately 40 stones of varying type and color, organized in a pattern that appeared to be chromatic but which, when I looked more carefully, was organized by surface texture, the smooth stones in one area, the rough ones in another, the fractured ones in a third. I asked him if he had any favorite. He picked up a piece of green serpentinite and turned it over in his hands and said, "This one is the oldest one. Serpentinite is indeed among the older rock types found in the Cascades, formed in the early Mesozoic period and brought to the surface by tectonic activity." Thomas was 5 years old and he had identified the oldest rock in his collection. I asked him how he knew. He said his father had told him, and that his father had said you could tell the old rocks by their weight, not their heaviness. He specified, correcting himself, but their weight, which was a different thing. He meant density. He was 5 years old and he was making a distinction between mass and weight that most adults use interchangeably. I worked at the Wind River Experimental Forest until 1991. 17 years in that valley. For the first 14 of those years, I visited the drainage when I could, less frequently as my supervisory responsibilities increased and my field time decreased, but I never went more than 8 months without finding a way back. Ruth and Clara were alive. Their children were growing. The family was stable, and the family's situation, as best I could determine, was not known to any other human being. In 1985, Wren was 11 years old. He had passed through what Ruth described as a developmental transition at around age 8 that had no direct parallel in human puberty, but that had produced in him a physical confidence and a spatial awareness that she said was striking to observe. He could navigate the entire upper Wind River drainage from memory in any weather condition, which is a drainage of roughly 60 square miles of technical mountain terrain. He had begun participating in hunting alongside Eric and learning the management of the family's territory. He had also, Ruth told me with a complicated expression I could not entirely read, begun composing. She said it so casually that I thought at first I had misheard. Composing what? I asked. Music, she said. She said he produced extended vocalizations in the subsonic register that she could feel but not hear, combined with a higher melodic line that she could hear, and that the structure of these compositions, which were complex, which repeated themes at intervals, which built and resolved in ways she recognized from the musical theory she had half remembered from her junior high school music class, and later formalized through the music theory textbooks I had brought her, was sophisticated in a way she could not account for by exposure alone. She said she had not taught him music theory. She said he had arrived at the structure independently, and that what he had arrived at was close enough to what she understood of Western compositional structure to be recognizable, but different enough in its harmonic choices to suggest he was working from a different underlying system. She said, "He hears things I cannot hear, and he makes music from what he hears, and what he makes is beautiful in a way I do not know how to describe to you." I left the Forest Service in 1991 to take a research position in Olympia, and for the first time since 1977, I could not make regular visits to the Wind River drainage. The drive from Olympia was 3 hours each way on a good day, and the field access I had used to justify my presence in the upper drainage was no longer available to me. I visited twice in 1992 and once in 1993, and on the last of those visits, Ruth told me something that has stayed with me every day since. She said Ren was 19. She said he had reached his full physical development, which by her estimation put him at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall and somewhere north of 800 pounds, though she had no precise measurement for either figure and I have never had cause to verify them. She said he had partnered the previous year, Ruth's word, partnered, with a female from what she described as another family group that occupied the drainage north of the Trapper Creek Wind River confluence, and that the two families had been in contact for years but had recently come to a new arrangement regarding territory and resources that had involved Ren's situation and required his participation in a set of negotiations that Ruth said she had witnessed and had found both moving and completely incomprehensible, because a significant portion of it had taken place in the infrasonic register and she had perceived it as emotion without content. She said that the night after those negotiations concluded, Ren had come to sit beside her outside the shelter. He was too large by then to easily fit inside, and he had put one hand on her shoulder with a gentleness that she said made her chest ache, and he had produced a long vocalization in the upper audible register that lasted perhaps 20 minutes. And when it was finished, he had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and he had said, in English, with the precise grammar he had always used, "Do you understand what I was saying?" She told him no. She told him she could feel that it was something important, but she could not make out the words. He had nodded the way he nodded when he was processing something, a slow, deliberate dip of his chin that she said he had gotten from Eric. He said, "I was telling you what I am." She asked him what that meant. He said, "I am the thing that has no name in your language, and I wanted you to hear how it sounds. Their son, by their mayan round." Ruth told me this in the autumn of 1993. And then she looked at me and she said, "He wanted me to hear it. He could have said it in English. He chose to say it in the language that fit what it was." I drove home from that visit thinking about what Ren had said, and I thought about it for years, and I am thinking about it now. He was 19 years old, born of a human mother and a father whose species has no agreed-upon name in any living language, growing up in the old-growth forest of the southern Washington Cascades, reading Moby Dick by firelight and composing music in frequencies his mother could feel in her teeth. and he had looked at the woman who had given him life and told her, "I wanted you to hear what I am," said in the language that fits. The thing I keep returning to, in all the years since, is the choice he made in that moment. He could have translated. He was fluent in English, more fluent than most English speakers, Ruth had always told me, with a vocabulary that exceeded anything she had been able to teach him, and that she attributed to whatever process of absorption and synthesis was happening in that remarkable mind. He could have given her the English version. He chose not to. He chose to give her the experience of receiving something she could not fully decode, because the thing he was telling her about was itself something she could not fully decode, and he wanted the form of the telling to match the content. That is a level of intentionality about communication that I have encountered in perhaps 3 or 4 human beings in my entire life. I want to tell you where things stood the last time I visited the Wind River drainage, which was in the spring of 2007. I was 68 years old. The drive from Olympia had become harder as my knees had become less reliable, and the hike from the road was 3.5 miles of moderately steep terrain that I had been managing on trekking poles for several years. Ruth was 59. She was healthy and she looked it. Mountain living had been, by every physical indicator, good to her. She moved with a sureness in that terrain that made my careful trekking pole progress look like what it was: the careful movement of an urban person in borrowed landscape. Clara was 56 and had what Ruth described as a cardiac condition that was managed by the family's own plant-based pharmacology. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I am not medically trained and cannot assess what was actually being done, but Ruth's description of the treatments Clara received suggested a sophisticated understanding of cardiovascular botanical compounds that was consistent with documented indigenous plant medicine practice in the Pacific Northwest. I was concerned about Clara. Ruth was not, or at least she was, not in a way that she allowed me to see. Both women's children were adults. Ren was 33, Thomas was 35. Both had families of their own in the broader network of related groups that, as I understood it from Ruth's descriptions over the years, occupied a loose territory spanning the upper Wind River drainage, the Trapper Creek watershed, and portions of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest extending north toward the Cougar Valley. How many individuals this network included, I cannot say with confidence. Ruth had given me numbers at various times that I was uncertain how to interpret because the boundaries of what she considered a family group and what she considered a neighboring group were fluid in ways that did not map cleanly onto human kinship structures. My best estimate, based on 17 years of accumulated conversations, was somewhere between 30 and 50 individuals across an area of perhaps 150 square miles of remote forest. On that last visit in 2007, Ruth gave me a package. It was wrapped in elk hide, tied with plant fiber cord, and she said she had been preparing it for several years. She asked me to take it and keep it, and to do with it whatever I thought best when I was no longer in a position to keep it myself. She said she was not asking me to publish it or publicize it or give it to a university or a government agency. She said she was asking me to decide, when the time came, whether the world was ready to receive what was in it. The package contained 3 things. The first was Ruth's journal. She had been keeping a journal since 1960, when Eric had, and this still strikes me as remarkable every time I think about it, found a cache of Forest Service field notebooks abandoned in a disused equipment shed north of the Wind River nursery and brought them home because he knew she missed writing. She had been writing in a continuous journal since age 12, with gaps only when notebooks ran out, and she was waiting for the next time I was able to bring her paper. The journals covered from 1960 to 2007. They were 53 years of daily or near-daily entries, written in Ruth's neat, deliberate hand, documenting the life of a woman and a family in a remote forest in southern Washington in enough detail to constitute a primary anthropological record of a kind that does not exist anywhere else in the world. The second thing in the package was a series of sketches. Ruth drew well. She told me Eric had been intensely interested in her drawing and had frequently sat beside her to watch the process, which she described as one of the early and sustained points of connection between them. She had drawn the family. She had drawn the shelter. She had drawn tools and food plants and terrain features and the children at various ages. She had drawn Eric's face, many times, from different angles and in different lights. The drawings were not the kind of drawings that serve as evidence in a scientific sense. They were not measurements, not technical illustrations. They were portraits, made by a woman who loved what she was drawing. And they were beautiful in the way that loving attention produces beauty, and they were the closest thing to a visual record that existed of what I saw in that clearing in March of 1977. The third thing was a plaster cast of Wren's handprint, made when he was 8 years old. The hand was 14 inches across the palm, and the fingers were long and broad and fully separated, and the detail in the cast, the fine lines of the palm, the whorl pattern of the fingerprints, was precise enough to be forensically useful. Ruth told me Wren had made the cast himself, pressing his own hand into a bed of plaster she had prepared from material I had brought her years before. She said he had been very serious about it. She said he had pressed each finger down individually and held the pressure for the full time she told him to. And when the cast was set and she had lifted it and shown it to him, he had looked at it for a long time and then said, "Now there will be a record." A fear. He was 8 years old, and he wanted a record to exist. There is one more thing, Ruth told me, in the last visit of 1993, that I have saved for the end of this account because it belongs at the end. It is not the most dramatic thing, she told me. It is not the most scientifically significant, but it is the thing I carry most consistently. The thing I think about in the quiet of early morning when I am not yet fully awake, and the day's accumulated noise has not yet begun. She told me about the first time it snowed in the second year of her time in the forest, December of 1959. Nearly a year after the December in which they had disappeared. She said the snow came on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning there were about 8 inches on the ground, which was enough to change the acoustic profile of the forest entirely, the snow absorbing the ambient sound and producing the particular hush that everyone who has spent time in forested mountains in winter knows. She said she woke that morning to that hush and lay in the sleeping area of the shelter and listened to it. And what she felt in that listening was not grief for what she had left, not grief for her parents or her childhood or the life she was not living, but something she said was harder to name than grief and larger than it, a sense of scale, a sense that the forest around her, in its 8 inches of silence, was communicating something about time that she did not have the categories to receive, but that her body received anyway. The scale of the trees, the scale of the silence, the scale of a winter that would have been happening in that forest, regardless of whether she was in it or not, that had been happening in that forest for centuries before any human was in it, that would go on happening long after the last human who knew about it was gone. She said she lay in that silence for about an hour before anyone else woke up, and at some point in that hour, Eric shifted in the sleeping area on the other side of the shelter, and in the particular acoustic conditions of early morning snow silence, she heard him breathe, a single deep breath, the breath of someone very large sleeping very quietly, and the exhale of it was long enough that she could hear it change in pitch as his chest settled. She said, "I heard him breathe, and I thought, I know that sound. I've been sleeping 20 feet from it for a year, and I know it the way you know the sounds of your own house, the sounds that tell you everything is as it should be, that nothing has gone wrong in the night. That morning is beginning the way it should begin," she said, and I thought, this is what home sounds like. Not the Wind River nursery housing, not the house in Carson where she had grown up before the nursery, not the school in Stevenson, not the Lutheran church where Edna Voss had gone every Sunday. This, the breath of something enormous and living and present, in an 8-inch hush of December snow, in an old-growth forest, in the southern Washington Cascades. Home sounds like this. I am telling you this because it is the thing that makes the whole story coherent, that reaches back and makes sense of every choice Ruth made and every choice I made, and that reaches forward into whatever comes next for the family in that forest. It is not a dramatic thing. It is not a revelation. It is the kind of truth that is the ground of everything else. Not the peak, but the foundation. The thing without which nothing else is supported. She found where she belonged, at 8 years old, in a ravine on the day after Christmas. By the grace of a situation that was terrifying and that she walked through to the other side of, she found where she belonged. Some people never find it. She found it at 8. I have kept that package for 17 years. I have kept it in a fireproof safe in my house in Olympia. I have not shared it with anyone. I have not made copies. I have done exactly what Ruth asked me to do, which was to decide when the time was right. I am 75 years old. My husband Jim died in 2020. My children are grown and scattered. My privier viand. My tid video dissect. My health is what it is, which is the health of a 75-year-old woman who spent 17 years walking in mountain terrain, which is better in some ways and worse in others than you might expect. I have been thinking about Ruth's package and about her question, whether the world is ready, for 17 years. And I have arrived at a conclusion that is not exactly yes and is not exactly no, but is something more like, the world is as ready as it is going to get, and the time for waiting has ended. I am not going to release the journals publicly. I am not going to give the handprint cast to a university. I am not going to contact the Skamania County Sheriff's Department or the Forest Service or any other institution because Ruth did not ask me to do any of those things, and I am not going to substitute my judgment for hers about what the material should be used for. What I am going to do is tell the story. I am going to tell it as completely and as accurately as I can, the way Ruth told it to me, because I made her a promise, and because I am 75 years old and the arithmetic of how many more opportunities I will have to keep that promise is not in my favor. The question I am asked most often, by the 3 people I have ever told any part of this story to: my sister, who died in 2015 and carried it faithfully; a colleague who asked me once, late at night at a conference in Portland, whether I had ever encountered anything in the field that I could not explain, and to whom I gave more of an answer than I intended; and a neighbor in Olympia named Margaret, who figured out enough of it, through years of patient friendship, that I decided she deserved the truth. The question they ask most often is, why did you not tell anyone? I have answered this question in pieces throughout this account, but I want to answer it directly and completely, because it is the right question and it deserves a complete answer. I did not tell anyone because Ruth asked me not to, and because Ruth's request was grounded in a correct assessment of what disclosure would do. Ruth had spent 19 years building a life and a family in terrain that was protected by its remoteness and by the absence of human awareness of what was there. The moment that protection was compromised, the moment a single person in a position of institutional authority was told what I had found in that clearing in March of 1977, the processes that would be set in motion were not controllable, and the outcomes were not predictable. And the risks to the family I had found were real and serious. Search and rescue operations, media attention, scientific expeditions, government intervention. All of these things would have followed with a speed and a momentum that neither I nor Ruth could have managed. And the family we were trying to protect would have been at the center of all of it, with no power over any of it. They had built their life in that forest on the understanding that the humans below knew nothing about them. That understanding was the foundation of everything. Remove it, and the foundation was gone. I also did not tell anyone because I understood, by the time I had my first conversation with Ruth on that bench, that the family was not evidence to be gathered. They were people to be respected, and respecting them meant honoring the privacy they had protected for a very long time with a great deal of care and intelligence, and not casually destroying it because I had stumbled into it and felt that my discovery entitled me to make decisions about what it meant. I am a scientist. I believe in documentation and in the accumulation of evidence and in the value of shared knowledge. But I also believe that the right of persons to determine what is known about them is prior to the scientific value of that knowledge. And what I had found in the upper Wind River drainage were persons, whatever else they were, whatever combination of known and unknown biology had produced them, whatever their relationship to the taxonomic and evolutionary frameworks my training had given me, they were persons, and they had not given me their consent to share what I knew about them with the world. Ruth gave me that consent, finally, for the story, not for the journals, not for the drawings, not for the handprint cast, for the story. She decided that the story should be told, and she asked me to tell it. And I am telling it. Everything else remains where she left it, in my keeping, and will remain there until she tells me otherwise or until I am no longer in a position to keep it. There is one other reason I did not tell anyone, and it is the one that is hardest to say in the context of a scientific career that I took seriously and that I am proud of. I was afraid of what would happen to the family if the world found out about them. Not abstractly afraid, specifically, concretely, historically afraid. I knew what had happened in the history of the Pacific Northwest and in the history of North America more broadly, when the existence of peoples who lived outside the institutional frameworks of the dominant culture became known to that culture. I knew the outcome was rarely good for the people whose existence was disclosed. The institutions that would have been mobilized by my disclosure, medical researchers, anthropologists, government agencies, media, would have had the best of intentions, and good intentions have never once been sufficient protection for peoples that powerful institutions have decided to study. I was not going to be the person who handed this family to those institutions. I was not going to do it in 1977, and I am not going to do it now. What I am doing now is telling the story because Ruth asked me to, and because the story is not the same as the evidence, and because a story can be heard and set down again, where evidence becomes property the moment it leaves your hands. I am telling you the story. The rest stays where it is. I have not been back to the Wind River drainage since 2007. I do not know what is there now. The Wind River Road has been improved, and the upper sections reopened as forest management priorities have shifted. The old-growth stands I worked in for 17 years are still there. I have checked. The Trapper Creek Wilderness area is protected, and the upper drainage north of it has never been offered for timber sale. Whether the families Ruth described are still in that terrain, I cannot say. I believe they are, because the forest that contains them is the same forest that contained them in 1975. When I first heard a stone struck against another stone on a slope above my transect line, and because nothing I know about the character of Eric or his people suggests they would have chosen to leave a territory they had occupied for what Ruth once told me, on the basis of things Eric had communicated to her over years of accumulated exchange, was a very long time. She said he told her once about a memory of the valley before the logging came. She said it was the longest continuous story he had ever told her, communicated over several evenings in a combination of the infrasonic register and physical gesture, and a drawing he made in the dirt of the shelter floor, a drawing she described as a map of the valley that showed the river and the ridgelines and the drainage patterns in the way someone draws a place they have known for generations. She said the drawing was precise. She said she had recognized every major landmark. She said he told her the trees had been larger, much larger, old enough and large enough that the canopy had closed over the valley floor, and in the summer, the light on the ground had been green, not yellow. She said he described this the way you describe something you miss. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular steadiness of someone who has accepted a loss and is telling it to you because they want you to know what was there. She said she had cried when he told her this. She said she had cried for the trees. He had sat beside her while she cried, and he had put one hand on her back, very gently, and said, not in English, but in the register she could feel in her chest, something she understood as, "This is why we remember. This is why we remember." I am 75 years old, and I was 9 years old when Ruth Voss left the hill above the Wind River nursery housing and did not come back. And I have been carrying this for 66 years, and I am telling it to you now because she asked me to, and because Ren was right when he pressed his 8-year-old hand into a bed of plaster and said that there should be a record. There is a record. It is in a fireproof safe in Olympia, Washington. It is 53 years of handwritten journals, and a portfolio of pencil drawings, and a plaster cast of a hand that is 14 inches across the palm. It exists because Ruth Voss spent 66 years paying attention to everything around her and writing it down. The way she had paid attention when she was 11 and sitting in a shelter in a snowstorm on a slope above the Wind River Valley, watching a family go about the business of evening by the conducted heat of a fire she could not see. She paid attention because that was who she was. And she trusted me with what she had paid attention to, because we had been best friends since the 2nd grade, and because at age 29 she looked at a Forest Service researcher standing in the snow on a bench above the Wind River and said, "I know who you are, Dorothy," and I believed her, and I was right to believe her. And the trust between us ran both ways and lasted the rest of our lives. There is a postscript to this story that I have been deciding whether to include for several weeks. And I have decided to include it because I said I would tell all of it. And this is part of all of it. In the summer of 2022, I received a message from Ruth through the system we had maintained since the late 90s, which was a small cache location at a specific point on the Wind River Road that I could reach by car without hiking. She left notes there when she had something to say and could get a runner down to the valley, and I left notes there when I had information she needed, and we had maintained this exchange reliably for 23 years. The message in 2022 was written in Ruth's handwriting on paper that I recognized as the same unlined white paper I had been leaving for her in the cache for years. It said, "Clara is well. Thomas is well and working. Ren has a granddaughter. Her name, in his language, means something like, 'The one who arrived in the season the old trees fell.' One of the largest firs in the upper drainage came down in the windstorm last November. She was born 3 days later. Eric says she carries the tree. I sat with that note for a long time. A granddaughter, Ren's granddaughter, which meant the 3rd generation of Ruth's line in the Wind River drainage. A child born 3 days after the fall of one of the oldest trees in a stand whose oldest members had been growing since before the first European had set foot in the Columbia River watershed. A child whose name carried that event forward. The way names carry the things that surround an arrival, the weather and the season, and the particular quality of the air. Her name means, "The one who arrived in the season the old trees fell." She is 3 years old now, or close to it, depending on when you are hearing this. She is living in the old-growth forest of the southern Washington Cascades. She is growing up the way her grandparents grew up and the way her great-grandparents grew up, with the soil of that forest under her feet and the canopy of that forest above her head, learning the things that can only be learned through long proximity to undisturbed land. What she is, there is no word for. What she knows, there is no category for. What she will become, I do not know. I am 75 years old, and I will not live to see it. But she is there. She is alive. She is 3 years old in the forest, carrying the name of a fallen tree. That is everything. That is the whole of it. I have told you all I know, and the rest of the knowing belongs to the people in that forest, who are minding it still. Ruth Voss is still alive. She is 76 years old. She is living in a place I will not specify, in a landscape that she has known since she was 11 and that has been, by every account she has ever given me, exactly the life she chose. Clara Voss is still alive. She is 73. The cardiac condition that concerned me in 2007 has been managed, according to the last message I received from Ruth. A note left in a hollow tree at a location she told me about years ago for exactly this purpose. In 2022, the note was brief. It said Clara was well. Wren and Thomas were well. There were grandchildren. I have one more thing to tell you, and then I am done. On the last day of my last visit to that clearing, in the spring of 2007, I stood at the edge of the bench above the Wind River Creek and looked out over the valley the way I had looked at it hundreds of times over 30 years. The Douglas fir below me ran in continuous green down to the Wind River Road. And beyond the road, the river itself was invisible in its canyon. And beyond the river, the nursery fields were visible as a lighter patch against the surrounding forest. And beyond that, the valley narrowed toward Carson and the Columbia. It was late afternoon. The light was coming in low from the west, the way it comes in the Pacific Northwest in early spring, warm and flat, and making everything it touches look slightly more itself than usual. Eric was there. He is always there when I visit. He stands at the tree line and he watches. And in 30 years of visits, he had never come closer to me than the 40 feet of that first meeting on the bench, which I understood as not fear but propriety, a sense of appropriate distance that he maintained not for his own comfort but for mine, or perhaps for the integrity of the thing between us, which was a transaction of trust maintained across a border that he was careful never to make me feel obligated to cross. But on that last afternoon, he crossed it. He came out of the tree line slowly, and he came to where I was standing, and he stopped about 6 feet from me. I looked up at him. I have looked at him many times from 40 feet, and I am telling you that 6 feet is a different thing. At 6 feet, I could see the gray that had come into the hair along his jaw. He had aged in the 30 years since I first saw him, in a way that was parallel to human aging, but not identical, a deepening of lines around the eyes and a settling of the body that communicated the passage of time without communicating fragility. His eyes were the same amber they had always been. The attention in them had not changed at all. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, and this was the first time he had ever directly addressed me, in any register, in 30 years. He said a single word in English. He said it carefully, the way someone says a word in a language that is not their first language, with the deliberateness of someone who has been thinking about how to pronounce it for a long time. He said, "Thank you. Thank you. Flux, thank you." And then he turned and walked back into the trees. And he was gone, and I stood there on that bench in the afternoon light, with the Wind River Valley laid out below me, and the old-growth forest closing in above me. And I said, to no one in particular, which might be the same thing, "You're welcome." I drove home. I did not cry until I reached the highway. I want you to think about the Wind River Valley the next time you are in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, or anywhere in the southern Washington Cascades, or anywhere in the western forests that still hold old growth, the 400- and 500-year-old Douglas fir, the western red cedar with their rust-red bark and their canopy that closes the sky. Think about what lives in those forests that we have not named, and what it has witnessed that we have not recorded, and what it knows about the world and about time and about the passage of things that we are only beginning to understand. We should have paid attention to. Pay attention. Write it down. That is all. I want to add one last account before I finish, because it is the piece of this story that took me the longest to understand, and that I think is the most important thing I have to say about what I observed over 30 years of visits to that clearing. In the summer of 1986, on one of my regular visits, I arrived at the bench and found not Ruth but Wren waiting for me. He was 12 years old, and he was sitting on the flat rock where Ruth and I usually sat, and he was reading. He had a book open in his lap, one of the natural history texts I had brought the previous year, and he was reading it with the focused, total absorption that is the specific reading style of people who are genuinely hungry for the material, not performing engagement with it, but actually inside it. He did not look up when I came onto the bench. He finished the page he was on before he acknowledged my presence. which I found so recognizably human that it made me stop for a moment at the edge of the clearing. He closed the book when he finished the page. He looked up. His eyes in the summer light were the same dark amber they had been the first time he looked at me at age 3, and they carried in them the same quality of attention that his father's eyes carried, that Ruth's eyes carried. The particular quality of looking that is not evaluation but recognition, the kind that makes the person being looked at feel that they are fully present rather than partially represented. He said, "My mother said you would come today." I said yes, that was the arrangement. He looked at the book in his hands for a moment. He said, "I have been reading about the old-growth ecosystem, the chapter on canopy stratification." He paused. The author says that old-growth canopy creates microclimates that cannot be replicated in managed forests. I said that was accurate, as far as my understanding went. He said, "How long does it take?" I said I was not certain I understood the question. He said, "How long does it take for a managed forest to become an old-growth forest, if you left it alone, if nothing intervened?" I told him the estimate from the research literature was 3 to 5 centuries for the structural complexity of old growth to fully develop. Not just the large trees, but the understory diversity, the canopy gaps created by wind throw, the accumulation of large wood on the forest floor, the specific mycorrhizal networks that are the metabolic foundation of old-growth ecosystem function. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father has been in this forest longer than that." He said it simply, not boastfully, not with any quality of amazement or drama. He said it as a fact that he was checking against the information in the chapter on canopy stratification, making sure the 2 data sets were consistent. I said, "I know." He said, "Does that change how you think about the forest?" I said it did. I said that understanding the forest as the habitat of beings who had been in it for centuries or longer changed my understanding of what the forest was for, and what it represented, and what the loss of it meant, not abstractly, but concretely, in terms of the community of beings whose context it was. He looked at the canopy above us for a moment. He said, "My father says that the oldest trees remember things that nobody else is left to remember, that the forest is the memory that persists when everything else is gone." He said it with the precise, careful weight of someone quoting something they take seriously. The forest is the memory that persists when everything else is gone. I have told you this story over many pages and many years of accumulated visits and accumulated trust, and I have tried to tell it truthfully and carefully and with the full weight of what it is. A 12-year-old boy, sitting on a flat rock in an old-growth forest in the summer light, reading a chapter on canopy stratification and asking me how long it takes for a managed forest to become what the forest around him already was, carrying forward a thought his father had given him. The forest is the memory. That is what I want to leave you with. Not a dramatic thing, not the thing that will make you doubt or wonder or argue. The 12-year-old boy and the open book and the summer light and the sentence that his father taught him, which is the sentence that has anchored everything I have tried to tell you here. The forest is the memory that persists when everything else is gone. Walk in it accordingly. The last note I received from Ruth, in the cache on the Wind River Road in 2022, included a postscript that I did not include earlier in this account because I wanted to consider whether it belonged here. "I have decided it does," she wrote. "I want you to know that when Wren's granddaughter was born, the one I told you carries the name of the fallen tree. Eric sat outside with her for the first hour, not holding her, just beside her, in the cold, with his hand close enough to feel the warmth from the bundle she was in. He stayed until she was taken inside. I watched from the doorway and I thought about the first night I came to the shelter, 30 years before, and the way he watched his family then. It is the same watching. 60 years of that watching, and it is exactly the same." She wrote, "I want you to understand that he is not unchanged by time. He is marked by it, the way the old trees are marked, not weakened but deepened, the rings accumulating, the bark thickening over old wounds. He has lost things in 60 years that I know of and things I do not know of. But the watching is the same. The quality of attention is the same. I have never in 60 years seen it diminish by so much as a fraction. She wrote, "Tell that part. When you tell the story, make sure you tell that part." So I am telling it. 60 years of the same watching. A man, and I use that word with the full understanding that it is a category error and the most accurate word available to me simultaneously, who sat outside in the cold with his great-grandchild for the first hour of her life and watched over her with the same quality of presence he had been applying to the people in his care since before the oldest living human on earth was born. That is what Ruth wanted me to tell you. Not the remarkable parts, not the scientifically significant parts, not the parts that defy explanation and invite argument. The part that is simple. He watched over them. All of them. He has been watching over them for 60 years, and the watching has not changed. That is the story. I am going to say one final thing, and then I am done. 47 years ago, I stood on a bench above the Wind River in the March snow, and a woman I had been looking for since I was 9 years old looked at me and said my name. In the 30 years I visited that clearing afterward, I was given something that I did not earn and could not have anticipated and have never been able to adequately explain, which was the trust of a family that had every reason to mistrust the world I came from and chose instead to let me in. I do not know what I did to deserve that trust. I did my best to honor it. Ruth Voss once told me that the thing she found most remarkable about her years in the forest was not the dramatic things, not the things that make the story remarkable when told to others, but the ordinary daily accumulation of the life she was living, the seasons cycling through, the children growing, the food gathered and prepared, the shelter maintained, the animals observed and known by name and habit, the long evenings in the shelter where the firelight from outside came through the gaps in the logs, and Eric's breathing filled the space, and Wren's compositions moved through the walls like weather. She said the ordinary was where the real life was. The dramatic moments were the punctuation. The ordinary was the sentence. I think about that. I think about what it means to have found the ordinary you belong in, and to have lived it for 60 years without apology or regret. Not everyone gets that. Most people do not get that. Ruth Voss got it in a forest ravine on the day after Christmas in 1958, and she recognized it for what it was before she had words for it. And she stayed. She stayed. There was a rhythm to those visits that I settled into without quite meaning to. The first few years, I went up 3 or 4 times each season. By the early 80s, I had brought it down to twice a year, spring and early fall. And that pattern held for the better part of 2 decades. I would drive the Wind River Road to the end of the maintained section and go on foot from there. The hike in took between 4 and 6 hours, depending on snow and the creek crossings. I always brought the same things: a notebook, a thermos of coffee, a canvas bag with dried fruit and hard cheese. There was something in me that needed to know I could stay if I had to. By the time I reached the upper drainage, I was always calm. Whatever I had carried in from the week, the month, the accumulated weight of ordinary life, it was gone by the time I reached that place. I do not fully understand why. I have wondered if it was the infrasound, if those years of exposure had some cumulative effect on my nervous system that I could not measure. I have wondered if it was simpler, if it was just the 6 hours of walking in clean air among trees that had been standing since before my grandmother was born. What I know is this: those 30 years of visits were not a sacrifice. People assume they were. When I describe the logistics, the secrecy, the planning required to keep the location protected, but they were not a sacrifice. They were the best hours of my life, the hours when I was most completely myself and most completely sure of what I was doing and why.